prescribed intravenous ampicillin. Now, for many elective surgeries, surgeons may not give an antibiotic. Usually it's not required. But in his case, the surgeon chose to give him intravenous ampicillin. So the nurse carried out the orders. I'm talking of around 1975, when ampicillin, intravenous ampicillin was not even easily available in the country. The nurse injected ampicillin, and before she could withdraw the syringe, the patient had died. So this was an anaphylactic reaction to ampicillin. An inquiry was launched, and since it was a serving High Court judge, this inquiry was turned into a criminal inquiry. And this was the first time in our history, in India, in medical history, that such a case of medical negligence, was converted into a criminal case. So the trial started. The surgeon's defense was that we don't generally test for anaphylaxis to ampicillin. Had it been crystalline penicillin, we would have tested, but for ampicillin, the general practice is that we don't test for anaphylactic reaction. So the case went on. So they got experts to chip in, and some professors of pharmacology, they opened up books in the court and showed that penicillin and all its congeners needs to be tested. The surgeon concerned fought on, but ultimately he had to resign, and he had to resign at the peak of his career. But still, I think he was lucky that, it didn't go on further than that. The thing settled with his resignation. But this thing can occur any time. Now, we are giving cephalosporins. Anaphylactic reactions can occur following cephalosporins. How many of us are prepared to manage an anaphylactic reaction to cephalosporin? It can be given at the dead of night, and the anaphylaxis following cephalosporins can be as serious as that following benzyl penicillin. In rheumatology, over the last maybe 20 years or so, in India, a number of trials have started being conducted. Now, the way the trials are being conducted, they are being funded by pharma companies. The ethics of conducting these trials are still in a very gray zone. What kind of consent is obtained from the patient before he or she is entered into the trial? I can tell you that at our institute in Chandigarh, the patients that we get, many of them would not understand what a trial is all about. When you seek a consent, they would say, Doctor Sahab, aapko jaise theek lagta hai, aap kar lo. That is the kind of faith that they have in you. But is it enough that, that kind of a statement is enough for his consent? I doubt. Because they won't understand the implications of entering into a trial. So to discuss these and many other issues, I think we have a galaxy of speakers. And at the end, I think we'll have Mrs. Seshadri telling us about issues about which most of us are blissfully unaware, but which we need to be, informed about. So to set the ball rolling, I would now invite Dr. Vignesh Pandeyarajan. He would be speaking on ethical issues in clinical trials in rheumatology and publication bias. Vignesh.
Ethical issues also, because whether you can start a novel therapy when you already have you already have a standard treatment available, and is it ethically appropriate to expose persons who might not develop particular disease to a potential harm and risks associated with intervention? So this is regarding the prevention studies. So this is one such trial, PROMPT trial, done for pre-rheumatoid arthritis. So these are patients who do not have frank rheumatoid arthritis, but they just have some joint pains and elevated RF factor. So these patients were randomized to receive methotrexate or placebo. And in this trial, it was found that the patients who received methotrexate, they had reduced development of rheumatoid arthritis and also less damage to the joints. So in preventive trials like this PROMPT trial, you have to know what is the natural cause of the disease. So pre-rheumatoid arthritis, not all the patients are going to develop rheumatoid arthritis. So when you're using a particularly toxic interventions like immunomodulatory drugs, identify patients who have a reasonable potential to benefit from them. So basically you need to identify a subgroup that could maximally benefit, and so that you can avoid patients who do not need it. So and also the informed consent process is very critical here, and participants should not harbor a preventive misconception here. So it should not be like this drug is used to prevent rheumatoid arthritis. So the informed consent process is very critical here. And regarding the post-marketing studies, the clinical trials, it establishes efficacy only for a short period of time. However, in rheumatology, we generally use drugs for long-term, and the long-term side effects you would be able to appreciate only if you do the post-marketing surveillance. So that is why you need the post-marketing studies. The one good example here is the use of COX-2 inhibitors, the rofecoxib, which is associated with fatal myocardial infarction. So this is picked up only with the use of post-marketing surveillance. So as I already said, the long-term exposure is the norm for the treatment of many rheumatic diseases. And if you see the trials, actually, you could see that patients who have significant comorbidities are excluded. So what is the implication? It potentially you can underestimate the safety profile of the long-term use of agents, and also the combination. If the patient has severe comorbidities, these patients tend to be on 2 or 3 DMARDs, combination DMARDs. So only if we do a post-marketing surveillance, we will be able to identify the complete safety profile. So whenever you encounter a patient to enroll in a trial for a novel therapy, or when you're prescribing a newer medicines, it is important to alert the patients to the possibility of both expected and unexpected toxicities that might evolve over the time. However, the long-term surveillance studies, it's not that easy. It can have barriers like it involves cost, you have to periodically report, and legitimate concerns about the privacy of patients' medical information. So there are registries developed in the West for these post-marketing surveillance, like the rheumatoid arthritis observation of biologic therapy. In Germany, the British Society for Rheumatology Biologics register. This is followed in the UK, and the Arthritis, Rheumatism and Aging Medical Information System in the US. So these are robust registries which does periodic post-marketing surveillance to see if there are any serious side effects associated with the medications. Now, moving on. So now we have seen about the ethical issues in the trials. The second aspect is the selection of the control arms. So here I want to introduce to you the concept of clinical equipoise. So this is a basic essential for any trial. So you conduct a trial when when the experts are uncertain whether a proposed treatment arm is better or worse than an alternative treatment. So there should be a factor of uncertainty. You cannot do a trial comparing methotrexate versus placebo in a rheumatoid arthritis now. So you can do a combination DMARDs in high-risk patient versus biological. That is acceptable, but you cannot do a trial when there is a standardized treatment and there should be a no better arm. So that is the basic meaning of clinical equipoise. So it can be considered ethically acceptable to randomly assign patient participants to different study arms, provided that the other aspects of the trial, such as provisions for monitoring and proper informed consents, are appropriate. However, even with the if there is a clinical equipoise, there can be ethical challenges. First is the obtaining a valid informed consent. So, as already alluded, the patients may not recognize the distinction between a clinical care and research, especially in government medical setups, and failing to understand that their medical care has been selected by randomization rather than by their physicians. And there is an obligation of clinician to provide personalized care, which is central to the medical practice, and the randomization may actually interfere with the personalized care. And third, individual patients may prefer one treatment to another, even in the setting of clinical equipoise, and there can be a strong reasons to honor these choices. In certain cultural settings, the concept of randomization may be unworkable because of the patient's above his own self-interest, and informed consent to medical treatment is fundamental in both ethics and law. To document the informed consent conversation and the patient's decision is very essential. In pediatrics, the consent is usually given by the parents or the legal guardian, and assent is needed for between 10 to 18 years. So, who could understand the management plan? This should be taken in 10 to 18 years. So, the patient autonomy is fundamental in clinical research. So, the process of informed consent. So, the patient must have a level of decision-making capacity necessary to make a meaningful choice. This includes their ability to understand the information disclosed, appreciate the potential risks and benefit, engage in a reasoning process to include alternatives, and express a choice. So this is not a simple task. It involves a lot of steps to make them actually understand what is randomization and what will be the future course, and the informed consent to be provided and taken in the language that they understand. Say for USA, for informed consent, it should be given by someone who has completed at least 8 years of primary school education, and the therapeutics for rheumatological disorders are getting complex. Over the years, you have a range of targets of treating agents, and there are intricacy of adverse events, especially with the biologicals. The long-term risk for malignancies has increased substantially. So providing relevant, understandable information is very essential. The third component of informed consent is that it must be given free of any coercive influences. That is, just for the benefit of receiving the drug, one should not be enrolled in a trial. For example, if for patients without insurance coverage, clinical trials afford them a mean to receive such treatment, which can have a coercive influence. So that should also be avoided. So to mitigate all these issues, a formative research protocol is being proposed. This is basically to assess the informational needs of potential participants, to develop means of communicating complex information, and it promises to help the improvement of quality of the informed consent. So this is being done in Western countries. It is not usually done in the trials from developing countries. And next comes the issue of placebo controls. Now that you have very new drugs that can target specific molecules, so what should be the appropriate comparator that you would use for future studies to study the new drugs? Under what circumstances should the use of placebos be permitted? And what is the responsibility of the sponsor or the healthcare payer in continuing to provide expensive therapies to patients after they have participated in the clinical study? So these are very important questions that one needs to have answers before you proceed on to the trial. So now the concept of non-maleficence. It refers to the concept of keeping the patient free from harm. So when you do a trial, if it is a placebo control, it provides, you can actually assess the safety and efficacy of the intervention now, because the effects and side effects are going to be crystal clear if you use a placebo. However, there is an ethical issue of placebo, of using placebo, especially if you have a therapy that is known to be effective and available. So the Declaration of Helsinki, it says that in studies where there is no proven prophylactic, diagnostic or therapeutic model, then you can use placebo. However, if you have a effective and available therapy, then the placebo controlled arm should preferably avoided. So I'll just give you an example. Suppose if you're considering a trial of adjunctive analgesic for rheumatoid arthritis that is designed to improve the joint pain. Assuming that all the patients in the trial continue to receive standard DMARDs, it could be ethical to use placebo in the control arm and the adjunctive analgesic in the intervention arm, as the patients could be easily monitored for the short-term discomfort. However, it would be unethical to use a control arm in which the participants would receive a suboptimal therapy that is likely to result in disease progression. So, you know that methotrexate monotherapy is less effective as a disease-modifying strategy than combination therapy in many patients with rheumatoid arthritis. And it becomes more difficult to justify the use of study designs in which methotrexate monotherapy being continued for a prolonged period of time in patients with ongoing active disease. So, in recognition of such results, the trials are increasingly providing the rescue in which you have the crossover design. So you have the crossover designs, the dose escalation of the background medication in addition to the background drugs that are going on. So you have the step-up design for the rheumatoid arthritis trial. So this is just to ensure that the patients are not undertreated for a disease that is otherwise potentially progressive over the time frame of study. So in a nutshell, you just cannot keep the patient on a prolonged monotherapy and allow the disease to progress. So that is not ethically correct. So next comes the concept of therapeutic equivalence, where there is evolving standards of care and treatment algorithm offer many effective options for the patients. So you have to use a study design in which a novel agent is compared with the suboptimal therapy. It is not ethically correct. So there is an increasing need for study designs that test the therapeutic equivalence or non-inferiority of true treatment regimes rather than the superiority of one agent over the placebo. So that's why you would see more studies that do non-inferiority trials just to address this issue of therapeutic equivalence. The alternative approach, which is used in many pediatric rheumatology trials, is you initiate the experimental therapy to all the subjects, followed by randomized withdrawal or continuation of an investigational drug. So this is called withdrawal design. Basically, you observe for disease flare, as has been employed in several studies of juvenile idiopathic arthritis. So this is called withdrawal study design. This has been used predominantly in pediatric rheumatology trials, where you expose all the patients with the experimental therapy and then you later withdraw. The next important component is the assessment of outcome. So the outcome measures are very important for the clinical trials because these can also have ethical implications. Suppose if you measure outcome by non-objective ways such as patients' well-being or physicians' assessment of health or the subjective measures, then that should not be taken. It should be objectively measured so that the likelihood of bias is minimized. So you have various response criteria you already know. So there has to be a validated measurement. And the concept of beneficence, this is also very important. So this is that clinicians trying to accomplish some good for their patients, either because of conflict of interest or by their own wish. So this can be a potential confounder. So this may affect that the clinician's goal of providing good for the patients is the potential could generate a potential conflict of interest. A clear example of this is where the investigator has a financial stake in the results of a trial. So this is just an example. A patient who underwent a gene therapy with an adenovirus died of a result as a reaction to the virus. And the principal investigator of the trial won a 30% equity interest in the company that owned the drug tested, and the university at which the study was performed also had an equity interest. So this financial consideration may not have affected the investigator's action, but such incentives present a clear conflict of interest to the ethical conduct of the research. So the other conflicts may arise from the financial compensation the investigators receive for conducting the studies. So mutual relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the academic physicians, like financial support, salaries, the publications, the career investment, so these all could be a potential bias in the research or the data that is generated. So the publication bias is a tendency of the clinical trial investigators. You would have seen many trials published in NEJM or ARD, Annals of Rheumatic Diseases. You would have the study sponsors, the pharmaceutical companies. They publish results that are statistically significant or positive or have a relatively large treatment effect. Trials that produce negative or inconclusive results are less likely to be published. So this could range from 20 to 70% of trials remain unpublished even several years after their completion. So this could generate an incomplete or a misrepresented evidence. So this is quoted as publication bias. So this can lead to an imprecise or an inaccurate estimate of the treatment effect of an intervention. And the pharmaceutical companies can voluntarily withhold the uninformative data for the publication. So that's why, recognizing these limitations, the NIH has formed the clinical trials where you have to register all the trials that you're going to conduct, and periodically you have to update the results so that whatever trial you're being done, it is the results are updated there. So the issue of conflict of interest, it threatens the integrity of the entire field of clinical research and patient care. So the company employees, they often write the papers, the negative results are not published, the positive results are repeatedly published, a positive spin is put on even the negative results. It can be, the negative results can be just twisted, and it is not unusual to highlight the secondary outcomes rather than the primary outcomes. So the shift of focus can be from the drug's intended effect to a secondary effect that seems more favorable. So even though it is published in journals, the financial conflicts of interest in the publications should not be ignored. Then lastly, the distributive justice, ethical consideration have been raised not only about the studies but about the treatment of patients after the studies have been completed. So this is the Declaration of Helsinki. It asserts that at the conclusion of the study, every patient entered into the study should be assured of access to the best proven prophylactic, diagnostic, and therapeutic methods identified in the study. So to conclude, clinical trials in rheumatology are necessarily associated with wide array of ethical issues. Selecting control arms require attention to the several ethical concerns that I have highlighted, and obtaining informed consent is a key ethical protection for research participants, and sufficient training in clinical research methods and research ethics is required. With this, I conclude my talk, and I thank you everyone for patient listening.
In Indonesia, and based on this trial, they showed that children who had received supplementary vitamin A had lower infantile mortality, had lower mortality from measles, had lower mortality from diarrhea. The results were so startling that this study was published, I think, in the Lancet, either the Lancet or the New England Journal. And based on the results of this study, the World Health Organization started supplementing vitamin A as a global policy. Now, a group of researchers in India who also were interested in vitamin A, they tried to replicate this study in India. And they found that vitamin A does no such thing. So this group in India was also equally renowned, and the first study was conducted at the National Institute of Nutrition in Hyderabad. Then they conducted a similar study in Delhi, and they found that the results of supplementation with vitamin A were nothing to write home about. So they wrote a rejoinder to the journal which had published the original study. And then a big dispute arose. So there were a series of rejoinders, a series of articles in defense of those studies. But when it was investigated, it was found that the original study in Indonesia that had been conducted had been supported by a multinational pharmaceutical company which had a patent on vitamin A. They had a monopoly on vitamin A throughout the world. So based on this monopoly, they funded this study in Indonesia conducted by a US group. I mean, the question which immediately arises is, why did the US group conduct this study in Indonesia and not in the United States, not in the European Union? But look at the fall off of this study. That vitamin A began being supplemented to children throughout the world. So this is where we have to be very careful about how the study is being funded. When the study was funded at that time, it was not usual to give your conflicts of interest. It was not usual to give information about who is funding the study. It appeared as if this group in US was funding it through its own resources. They did not tell that it was a multinational company which was not only funding the study but also supporting the researchers. Similarly, in rheumatology, the COX-2 story is not that old. We know that in the COX-2 trials, several important aspects of information were withheld or not clearly disclosed. As if that was not enough, we now have the entire gamut of biologicals bombarding rheumatology. And this is one area where we have to be very, very cautious, because these are new drugs. The total experience on safety of these agents is not more than 10 to 15 years. And all of us who have used biologics for our patients have had sometime or the other unpleasant experiences. So all of us need to be very aware about how these trials have been conducted. Most of the trials being conducted in India on biologics are funded by pharma companies, and they do more than just fund the trial. So the incentives that they give to the investigators may not all be above board. Sometimes the laboratory investigations of these patients are conducted not in the institute or the hospital, but in laboratories that are funded by these drug companies. So again, the results become somewhat questionable. So you have raised some very important issues about how these trials need to be done, about the safety concerns of the patients. So with that, I would now open the talk to comments from the floor. Sir, Dr. Devashi started.
Thank you, sir. In this world of today, ethics and morality are empty words. I did not understand really because the concept of ethics and morality for a student was different, and for being a doctor was different. And as you have very beautifully, in detail, you have explained, what has happened is not only it will be enough to point out, okay, we now find pharmaceuticals are the real corruptors of medical practice. It is true. There's no escape from the fact. I was reading 2 days back Harrison's textbook of medicine, which is the most respected textbook of medicine. 55% of the recommendations of management are influenced by industry. That is, the authors have been somehow, directly or indirectly, have been bribed. Bribe doesn't mean paying cash, it can be so many other ways. So it has come to that level. We have also got so much used to the comfort of the having a conference in a nice ambience, and I'm sure I don't want to have a conference next to a dhaba on the roadside. I have to have a decent this thing, but we have forgotten where it has taken us to. I won't name. Somebody shouted this morning, "There's no breakfast here." Actually, the hotels have breakfast. Wherever you put up, there is breakfast. But somebody expected the breakfast to be there. So much food to get wasted. So it has not happened. And rightly or wrongly, the Medical Council or National Medical Commission is trying to impose a lot of things. They are also in a dilemma how to do it, how not to do it. I just came from ACR. You cannot even have a cup of coffee from an industry stall. They'll scan your badge so that your all details are there with them. If an industry spends more than $10 on a doctor, the industry is fined heavily. So this is the other extreme. But I tell you, fine, we know it is bad. We know it is, if it is changing our practice, is bad. It should not change our practice. And ideally speaking, we have all taken Hippocratic oath and we follow all that. But on the other hand, I have another aspect. We know ethics, we know non-ethical practice, but there is another angle which has come up, is a very hypocritic stand of pseudo-ethics. I tell you one thing, that, for example, it is a fact to have a conference of 1,500 people coming here, staying here, all the logistics, the charges for the halls and travel and food and everything. Who pays for it? People earning 5 lakh rupees income per month asking for a concession for a registration for a workshop. You see, very few people sitting in the hall. So then finally who pays for it? It is the industry pays. So what is the way? It is our own conscience that we can do it. Now how pseudo-ethics is coming, even the regulations, for example, see, how will government impose a ethical standard? There was one formula which was going on for last many years. You sign an agreement with the industry that you are taking the grant from the industry for your travel and stay, everything, but it will not influence your practice. What do you think about it? Indirectly or directly, it does influence the practice. Is it true, or whether accept or don't accept it happen? The second, what is that? You collect all the money as non-unrestricted educational grant to the society which conducts the meeting. Society collects the money and it distributes that to the participants as a travel grant. That's what the American College of Rheumatology does, Australian College of Rheumatology does, and we are also in that process now. So all the money, so the Congress authority, organization becomes a site, the part where the money comes from industry and goes back to the hotels, event managers, all the things. So it is like putting the gun on somebody else's shoulder and firing, then shooting directly. So is the ethics, is something can be that, is it ethics or is it a pseudo-ethics? Will it indirectly or directly influence our practice or not? I think it's a long way to go. It needs a real big, lengthy debate to understand what is truly ethics and what is non-ethical and what is pseudo-ethical. unless I go there, whatever experiment they do, it will fail. And I can tell you that one of the biggest thing in politics, it is always there, it has come to medicine also, is the rivalry, professional jealousy. Today, the ruling party will find everybody in the opposition who were ruling 5 years back are corrupt, put them to jail. 90% of them are not genuinely corrupt. They, in spite of accepting the fact that politicians can be corrupt, but many of them not corrupt. Same party when it goes to opposition, next another party will come to power, they will put half of them to jail, saying you are corrupt. So it is almost a vindictive culture. Same thing in medicine. Professional jealousy has come to such a state that people don't mind, putting your other colleagues into, difficult position because he or she is professionally become more important than you, or more prominent than you, or published more than you, or become more popular than you. So what I'm trying to say that I think this exercise should go on every year in every Iracon and even between the Iracons, and we should really work out how to really genuinely implement that. We can have medical research, we can have education, we can have patient education, we can have publications, we can have congresses in a way that it is decent, it is civilized, it is not full of poverty. At the same time, it doesn't affect our practice. So it's good thing to have a few things in detail than having multiple talks. So I think you have done in a detail very nicely. But I am trying to say that it is just a beginning. We still do not know, because many of us may be doing unethical practice without knowing it is unethical. So what I am trying to say, this exercise must be taken very seriously, because it will put some of our colleagues into trouble for no reason or rhyme. There is probably no escape for industry. Today, sir, if you try for a grant from the government bodies, ICMR, DST, DVT, CSIR, you try for a fund for randomized control trial, you will not find it. But you will get it from industry. Now, it will be there written that industry is not influenced this, that, but finally, it does influence somehow. You will not see each and every data what is entered. It is done by study coordinator, who may be quietly influenced by the industry. Okay, he has got 20% efficacy, he's got 25% or something. So they do that. So it is a very difficult, very sensitive, and a very complex issue. I am very happy that IRA, Indian Medical Association, Dr. Surjit Singh, when we were in the same executive committee, we had appointed Dr. Surjit as the chief of the ethics committee of IRA, and to have a ethical guideline which he has done based on American Medical Association and some other bodies. And we are trying to walk the path of some ethics, if not completely ethical. But I think the pseudo-ethics is a real problem, and that is something all of us are fraught with every day. Thank you, sir.
Vignesh mentioned about informed consent. I was at the Great Ormond Street Hospital training in 1990, and that was the time when the Swiss multinational company Roche launched the first molecule for granulocyte colony stimulating factor, GCSF. And some of the small babies who had just undergone bone marrow transplant, they were to be included in that trial after the induction phase to boost their white cell counts with this product. And I remember when they took the consent, the parents had to sign a sheaf of papers this thick, literally this thick. And each session at taking informed consent was something like 1 to 2 hours before they enrolled each baby into that trial. Now that is what an informed consent is. I'm afraid this kind of an informed consent is not taken in most countries. Because here especially in countries like India, where our clinics are so heavy. Who does the clinical research? It is usually the busiest clinician, because he's likely to get more grants based on his research profile. And he or she is likely to have the least time available to conduct these trials. So what happens is, he deputizes his work to his juniors. And the way informed consent is taken in our country may not be the best way to take an informed consent. So I would like to, have your own experience of how this informed consent is taken. Even some of our junior colleagues, if you've seen informed consent being taken, we would like you to share your views on how informed consent is taken in practice. Anyone? Saurabh.
And treating doctors directly should interact with the patient, and as you mentioned. So in our country, maybe informed sheet may be less, not many number pages, but the treating doctor should make sure patient should understand the consent and what is this. But actually, I have seen in many places, blank sheet has been signed by the nurses. I've been signs taken by the nurses from the patient, on the blank sheet.
Problem in our country is that most of the time, the GS doctor in that hospital or that setup, because he has got largest number of patient load, and pharmaceuticals are also supporting these one only, rather than choosing a doctor who is interested in research, may have little less of patient load. In addition to this, the problem is that most of the time the paperwork is picked up from European or United States companies, where paperwork is really low. Paper volume is very high, but these papers are not even read even once by the doctors. You must have read that in our, very rightly you pointed out, in our state for last 10 years we have been struggling with drug trials now. And drug trials, the negative side of drug trial, or the darker side of drug trial has been projected so badly, even up to the level of ICMR or our NMC, that government of Madhya Pradesh has banned any kind of drug trials in government institutions or for private colleges also. Of course, with some their own ethical committees, some of the private institutes are conducting these drug trials, but only negative or darker side has been projected so far. So you rightly said, when so much pile of paper is there to be signed by before giving consent, or looking into so many different aspects of a research is overlooked, problems are likely to occur definitely. So of course we'll have little more clearer concepts from the rest of the speakers. Any more comments from the audience?
One more issue about pharmacological cancer risk, malignancy risk with the molecule. But when this generic molecule came, then that company has launched issued a warning certificate about this risk. So after completion of their patent, and when other company came, so this is pharma bias, and this is the competition, and this is the what this industry driven.
I would like to ask Ms. Seshadri,
Dr. Subba,
the problem with informed consent, will it have a legal sanctity if the informed consent is signed in a language which the patient does not understand? Because most informed consents would be in English, and suppose there is a patient who is not fluent in English, will it stand the scrutiny of law?
In our next session, of course, my friend Mr. Bajpai will be dealing with consent itself for the entire session, his session, because consent is one of the biggest issues we see around medical practice in courts. Now, the whole idea of consent is it rests on patient autonomy. Your intentions may be fantastic as a doctor, you really want your best for that patient, but ultimately that patient decides what has to happen with his body. And therefore, any treatment that you give, whether it's diagnostic or whether it is surgical, any treatment should have his consent, which we've now understood is more than just consent, signing off. It has to be he has completely understood what's going to happen to his body or what you intend to do with his body. And in that process of giving him that information, you will be discussing what are the pros and cons of that treatment, what are the alternatives if he doesn't take that, what else could happen, what else can be done. You will be doing a risk-benefit analysis with him on doing it, in some elective cases not doing it, lifestyle changes instead, etc. So all this, for him to understand, only the man who is doing that treatment can actually explain this properly to him. In several hospitals, like doctor was mentioning here, a big problem is it's a nurse or a junior doctor who comes in. The process of taking consent is very casually done. This detailed discussion hasn't happened. There are hospitals where I've seen video recordings of consent taken very seriously. They sit in a separate consent room and they take a video recording of the process, etc. Even for, let's say, the post-stroke, that medicine being injected. Now, you've asked me specifically about language. So I have seen in a case where it was taken in English, Tamil speaking patient, but a doctor in the family as well. The daughter-in-law is a doctor. So they've taken a consent, they've printed. Of course, standard form consent forms are not great, but you can department-wise standardize where you mention risks of specific surgeries. This has a 2 to 3% risk, etc. in those forms. I've seen forms where you have English on one side and the local language on the other side. So probably in Chennai, we will say do English and Tamil, English and Hindi. We also have a lot of people coming from, used to come from Bengal, etc. You will have both. It is definitely a better practice. In this case, I also saw the daughter-in-law's handwritten consent was taken, and yet it reached the court on the issue of consent, despite all these precautions. So to answer your question, doctor, I think it is a better practice because we are talking of ultimately protecting ourselves, yes, but also that the patient has actually understood to safeguard patient autonomy. And therefore, using their language does make sense where it is possible to do so. And it really is no great difficulty in doing it these days. I hope that answers, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you. We have two very senior rheumatologists in the audience, Dr. Renu Saigal and Dr. Debashish Danda. They would remember that in the 80s, we had a group of anti-inflammatory drugs, oxyfenbutazone, phenylbutazone, and that was the only group that was used in clinical practice. I remember as interns, when we were posted in orthopedics or when we were posted in medicine and looking after rheumatology patients, as interns we used to prescribe that group of drugs. It is now banned. That group is now banned. It was manufactured by, I think, Siba Gaigi at that time. Now, it is banned because this group of drugs can result in fatal agranulocytosis. Now, it seems that the companies, the manufacturers knew about this side effect. But as Dr. Danda was mentioning, they did not publicize it enough. They knew that this can result in fatal agranulocytosis, and this agranulocytosis was irreversible. So I would like to have Dr. Renu Saigal's comment on this group of drugs specifically because it was the rheumatologists who were using it, and maybe Dr. Danda also can comment on his experience of the NSAIDs.
When we were doing our MD, this drug was indicated in ankylosing spondylitis, as far as I remember. So this was the only drug which was recommended. Later on, it was withdrawn because of the side effect.
Dr. Danda, the legacy of NSAIDs, which is in a way nothing to be proud of, because I think every 10 years we have had some accident or the other.
Yes, sir. We have probably rheumatology is one of the fields where the new medications are coming every year, and we have seen so much change in our own practice from our student days, residency days, and today. Uh, I think another is, I mean, oxyfenbutazone or phenylbutazone. Yes, we have just seen the last part of it because we are getting the little better than them NSAIDs. But certainly rofecoxib story is something very close to me because I know when rofecoxib was launched, I was requested from CMC Vellore by one of the Indian Medical Association dinner meetings to talk on a launching meeting, a talk on rofecoxib, because Vioxx, it was a trade name. And when I was preparing the talk, I read the literature. It was very clearly there in a small prints that it increases risk of coronary artery disease and thromboembolism.
How small? Microscopic?
It was around 1.5% or something. But I can tell you, it is how you present also. I was just attending few minutes of Dr. J.P. Mulil in Vellore, is an excellent teacher. So you're having a critical appraisal workshop there. So he was showing how industry projects data. It's a statistical jargon which many of us don't understand. So you say, drug A is 1.8%, say statin, a new statin is 1.8% additional risk of protection from heart attack, and placebo, which is standard practice, is 1.2%. So it's only about 0.6%. So it will not be appealing. So the industry will request the statistician, I cannot sell the drug by this, 1.6% difference. Then he said, look, it is 1.8 minus 1.2 divided by 1.8, which comes to 33%. So statins make 33% protection from mortality. Then it will sell in the market. So this is the way they had hidden the mortality risk and coronary artery disease from the risk of Vioxx. And see the nasty war. The pharmaceutical industry is no less than the politicians. I was in Australia for 3 years, and that is the time Vioxx was in peak. And that time, the complaints came, and FDA very categorically or quietly has suppressed the facts, and they did not put in their website also. Obviously, we are not the only corrupt country. They are also, and they somehow escaped. But when it came to notice that no, it causes significant risk of mortality and thromboembolism, then came. Now what happens? Then they found, okay, higher the selectivity of COX-2, higher the coronary and artery and cardiovascular disease. So celecoxib is least toxic in terms of cardiovascular toxicity. Rofecoxib, etoricoxib are much higher toxic. Then what happens? The company lost, Vioxx was banned, they went out of market. They didn't sit quiet. Other toxic company found, then they started finding out witch hunting. They found, looked at all the standard NSAIDs. They found all NSAIDs also increase cardiovascular toxicity. So then they said, look, why you are blaming us? You are using NSAID for regular non-classical classical NSAIDs, which are non-selective. They cause same amount of cardiovascular risk. So what I am trying to say that it is impossible for a medical practitioner to be on the guards unless we learn the critical appraisal tricks of published data. What is the truth? Every randomized controlled trial is not a gospel truth. Whatever comes out there, if you read just the conclusion, it doesn't make any sense. P-value of less than 0.05 makes no sense. The clinical significance, applicability, and statistical significance are different things altogether. So our education, our model of education is so much, I would say that it completely, if you ask today 100 practitioners or even all the medical practitioners in this country, I will bet if more than 1,000 doctors are aware of what is critical appraisal. If you do not know that, you will just go by, oh, this is come in Nature Review, this is come in Science, this is come in NEJM, this is come in Lancet, so this must be gospel truth. No, it need not be. As I told you, Harrison's textbooks have been corrupted. So unless you know how to do critical appraisal, we will never know what is the truth. So what I am trying to say that It is time our medical curriculum has to be made in such a way that every medical student and doctor and intern is able to analyze the studies that look, what is written in conclusion is not the fact. We have to know how to critically apply.
Doctor, just a thought process when I was listening to this. See, what doctor says about critical appraisals and putting across, there's something called a learned intermediaries and how a risk to you as a doctor and probably a role for associations to play. Doctors are expected to be in product liability cases. Doctors are seen in several jurisdictions as learned intermediaries who know more about that product. Let's say you've done knee replacement, a hip replacement, or in this case drugs, etc. You're supposed to have, some jurisdictions are holding doctors liable for not having explained this, 0.6, 33%, etc. to doctors. We haven't reached there yet, I think, but it's something we have to prepare for. Maybe associations, I don't know. This is an ongoing education process, because someday somebody will be starting to call your learned intermediaries with a greater duty in that consent process to have mentioned these kind of things. Not today, but in the future.
I saw a hand here. Yeah, please.
I'm Dr. Subramanian. I come from a private institution, so I just want to ask for a larger picture. We have been talking about, pressure from industry or whatever it is on an individual. What about pressure, ethics when you're coming to a pressure from an organization or pressure from a government? Let's say that in a private institution, your promotions, everything is based on the amount of things that you fill up on your PBAS, or your institutional ranking is based on NI, RF and NAAC, which does demand on the amount of research work or how much of work that you're listening. Does these ethics also come into matter when we are facing some legal problems and all those things? Because I think it's not only a peer pressure that is generating, it's an institutional pressure, it's a governmental pressure, because everything is based on ranking system, everything is based on so many things. So I'm not sure whether it is relevant in whatever, if you may choose not to answer, but I think the pressure is there from everywhere. Because being in a non-governmental setup, it becomes even more difficult to draw a clean line as to where you would stand in a clinical trial or your research or anything like that. So if you could just address that issue as well.
I think that's a very sensitive issue, very, very sensitive issue. I know that in big corporate hospitals, who may be half their age, and they have to justify that in this given month, what revenue have you generated for the hospital based on your investigations. I'm sorry I'm opening this, very, very nasty subject, but it's a fact. I mean, for Mrs. Seshadri, she may not be aware of this, but this is a reality. This is a reality. Suppose I have a headache, and I think I have a doctorate in headaches because I have migraines all the time. Now, if I report to a hospital and if I am asked for an MRI, I know it's not indicated. A CT scan is not indicated, but it's done. If I go with a backache, there is no way I can escape an MRI. Just no way. So these are things which, happen all the time. But at least we are now discussing them out in the open in the Indian Rheumatology Association. I think we must be about the only society where things are coming out of the closet. I'm so happy that you have raised this subject. We know that it's happening. Let's start debating, let's start discussing so that we, put an end to it in some way or the other. Sir, Dr. Danda.
Sir, if I have a couple of minutes, very important point. One is, as you said, if you go with a headache doing an MRI, certainly over the last 15-20 years in India, the medicine has become so much defensive. For example, if Dr. Pandey comes to say I'm a private hospital owner, they comes to my hospital and there's a headache, I will think Dr. Pandey is a reputed physician here. If something goes wrong with him, I will be held responsible. So even if it is not indicated, it may be migraine, it may be toothache or whatever it is, I might do an MRI. That is one. And second thing is, this is the defensive medicine. Second thing is, in my hospital, certainly at the end of, I'm not saying where I'm working, I'm saying that suppose I'm a corporate hospital owner or I'm working in a corporate hospital, they will assess my performance based on what you said exactly, that how much revenue you have generated for the hospital. This is very, very sad and which is a very ugly fact. It is true whether we accept or don't accept. Second thing, sir, about Advocate Seshadri's words and about informed consent. Sir, I just tell you a simple example. If you have to see a patient decently, you take 5 minutes history, 5 minutes examination, 5 minute documentation of basic minimum facts, and 5 minutes explaining with the prescription. You cannot see with a minimum dignity of human being of anybody with less than 20 minutes. If you see that way, you have to sleep 1/3 of your time in sleep, another 1/3 goes for everyday activities of life. So you cannot see more than 20 patients a day. You have to eat, you have to sleep, you have to walk, you have to have a family, you have something. But what is happening in real life? The more popular the doctor, the better known is the doctor, the more number of patients he has to see. Before the patient can even say the word, you write it. My informed consent. Is it possible in real life to write mycophenolate causes this or methotrexate causes this in the case? And in a court of law, nothing stands unless what you write on the tissue. How is it possible in real life for the doctors to document that in the case record? It is just impossible. We cannot just blindly follow whatever the Westerners are doing. As I said in America, you said 20-page informed consent. It is like in internet you are reading something, I accept. After small prints of 30 pages, which nobody can read, it might even say, I will jail you if you do something. I have to accept it. Otherwise, I can't open the software. I cannot even read that article. So what I'm trying to say that these kind of things I feel should go away. I remember one very beautiful saying with Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, an income tax form can say, no government form should be more than 1 page and more than 5 sentences. I think that's how it should be. Because it is impossible for people to this thing, and today the doctors are responsible for things which doctors are not responsible for everything. There is no medicine on earth which has got no side effect. Anything I tell the patients always one thing, sir, anything has got effect has also side effect. Anything has no effect has no side effect. I cannot give anything with no effect. I can only give anything side. If you read paracetamol and vitamin B complex, there is hundreds of side effects listed there. How can a doctor document this in busy practice? So this is one dilemma, I think, for the doctors, Mrs. Seshadri and Dr. Surjit and Dr. Pandey can clarify.
Okay, with this we'll go on to, thank you Vignesh, we'll go on to the second speaker. This talk is on
plan for research, because you must be aware of, or you must be knowing about doctor's trial, and doctor's trial also famously known as Nuremberg trials. And it is in 1946, 23 doctors, they were involved in certain research, and on the guise of mass murder, and they are punished because the research they were carried out was really heart-wrenching and abominable. What they did was they removed stomach, they removed intestine, and deliberately create fractures by using different forces, and also they injected bacteria into the circulation of the war prisoners. And for this, 23 doctors, they were mostly from Germany. They got death, 7 got death sentence, and others also received life imprisonment and imprisonment up to 10 years. So to protect the interest of the participants in the research, ethics came into the picture. Then when we talk about ethics on biobanking research, then we should know what is biobanking. So in bank, we used to put our money, but in biobanking, we store our samples, blood, or any material that related to biology. So we can store human tissue. Apart from that, you can store animal tissues, and you can also store the plant tissues from the plant origin. And what is the purpose? The purpose is to do research. And in 2009, in the front page of the Time magazine, they published it is one of the world-changing ideas, and this was biobanking. So in today's world, the biobanking facility is available more than 120 countries, and India also, we have many centers, they have the biobanking facilities, and they are involved in different area of research. So what is a biobank research systems? In biobank research systems, there is a biobank and there are many stakeholders. There are primary researchers, and there are secondary researchers, and there are the participants. So what is the benefits of biobanking research? The purpose is that it improves the overall public health, and there is the chance that we can develop a new diagnostic and therapeutic modalities. And overall in this era, the issue of personalized medicines. And there are many stakeholders in this. Apart from your healthcare providers, there are policymakers, there are investigators and industries and funders and data management like IT also involved in this process. So biobanking research is not without any risk. Although in genetic research there is no direct harm or physical harm is minimal, there are other issues that one should be aware of. And there is a possibility of group harms, moral harm or psychosocial harm. And there is a possibility one segment of populations who are participating in research on their finding, on the basis of genetic finding, there is a possibility of discriminations and stigmatization. So what are the ethical issues in genomic research? In genomic research, large number of populations take participate. The sample size usually is very large, and we disclose the results or disclose the finding of any specific research. What can happen? It can result in anxiety and depression in the participants. There can be psychosocial harms, and this group of people also may be denied from job, and it is other factors is social stigma, and they may be subject to your discriminations or racial discrimination. On the other hand, if you carry out a research on a particular topic and that related to genomic, and if you are not disclosing the results, it's a matter of ethical injustice, and that can hamper the public sentiments or hurt the public trust of the researcher. So there are some questions on ethics in genomic research. So the questions, most important questions are, if a subject or if a populations are participating in this research, whether they have right to withdraw from the research at any point of time. And if you sometimes you get additional results, it is not always you get the primary result you intended for to carry out the research. You also get some additional mutation in the genomic research. So it is a matter of debate whether you are going to return back all the results that you found while conducting a genomic research. Then there are many other issues like what is the risk and benefits of data sharing among investigators through the open access way. All genomic data or genomic research data are always shared through the open access way. So that is the issue of debate. And in certain situations, if a group of populations are predisposed to any cancer or in particular disease, there may be many other informations, but not always having a genetic or pathogenic variant is not always translation into disease, or may not a patient populations may not have that disease later on. So in that context, how much information that we are going to be provided to the study populations or the participants. So all these are the gray areas in genomic research. The other important issues in genomic research is about the privacy, about the confidentiality, and we have discussed about the informed consent law, and there are other issues like commercializations, patenting, and benefit sharing. So there are only few guidelines on genomic research, and in our country, Indian Council of Medical Research have laid down the guideline on ethics on research, and out of this, first thing is for any research is the non-maleficence. Non-maleficence means first is do no harm. Then is all the research, the purpose of research is to for the beneficence, so the benefit of the society or the populations of the participants. And what is important for the researcher also has to minimize the risk that is involved in the research process. And all the research has to be undergone ethical review by the Institute Ethics Committee, and one should ensure voluntariness, compliance of the participant in the population. We talk about consent or informed consent. The informed consent, what I do in informed consent, we explain the participants about the research activity, what is the results that we are going to get, and what are the benefits we would like to get, and what is the risk of participations in the studies or in a research. So when we talk about research about genomic, especially genomic research, there is a concept called broad consent. So what is a broad consent? Broad consent means you are not taking consent for the present research. We will also plan for future research. For that also you have to take consent. And when you are doing this also, one has to take consent for release the data into the open access website or public database. So what is the broad consent? It is the current practice. Basically, broad consent, we respect the autonomy of the participants. The risk involved is minimal, and it is always cost effective. Because when you are planning for a future research, it is very difficult to call again them and take consent for multiple times. So at one go, you take consent for the planned research and the future research. And in broad consent or broad consent concept, there is always an opportunity to withdraw anytime from the research. But the opponent says it is misleading to ask for participants about the informed consent for research that is not yet planned and that is unforeseen. So that has to be, the protocol is not ready. So how can you ask somebody about the consent of research which is planned in future? Another important issue is genomic research is withdrawn from the research. So in that case, it is the right of the participants or the populations at any point of time they can withdraw from the research. In that case, what we will do, all the samples that has been collected in the biobank, that has to be destroyed. All the results that has been obtained has also to be destroyed. But when the data or the results already displayed in a particular website, it's very difficult to destroy them, and there is always a controversy what to do in that situation. Another important issue in genomic research, there will be incidental findings. So how to address this issue of incidental findings? So it is the moral responsibility of the primary researchers or the secondary researchers to explain about the findings, and they have to go back to the participants and explain this, what is the clinical implications. At the same time, it is very important to preserve the confidentiality, the privacy of all the subjects. At the same time, one has to ensure there is a minimum harm to the family as well as to the society. Another issue is compensation for participants in genomic research. There is definitely our Indian Council of Medical Research has provided some guideline on these compensations, but in genomic research, the harm is not physical. The harm is, it is more of a moral, or there will be depression or anxiety regarding certain findings. But it is very difficult to quantify the harm that is made to a certain individual. in that situation, how to quantify or how to assess the quantum of compensation. That is another area of debate. And for that, adequate counseling should be done for the compensation of the participants in the beginning of the research. Other important thing that can happen involving research and the data abuse. So that data can be used for political purposes and control or to punish certain citizens or distinct segment of the populations. This also can be utilized for employment decisions and insurance calculations. So the ethics committee for any genomic research, ethics committee has to play an important role, and the ethical principle that is applicable for any research also applicability to the genomic research. And the purpose of this ethics committee is to protect the interest of the participating individuals or the group of population in genomic research. And for ethics committee to having a good quality ethics committee, need to have a mandatory registration of this ethics committee, and they should be accredited. So my take-home message is genomic and genetic research are fast expanding, and there is no clear-cut guideline at present, and there always will be a dilemma obtaining the informed consent in genomic research, and any populations can at any point of time they can withdraw from the research process. And the dilemma also there regarding the addressing the incidental finding while conducting the genomic research, and in that role of ethics committee is also very important to conducting a smooth and ethical and genomic research. With this, I conclude my talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pratap. So, Sanger sequencing or whole exome sequencing, this number is increasing, and we always try to take a consent, a specific consent for genetic test. So each institution has its own setup. At PJ Chandigarh, we also have our own consent form before ordering a genetic test. But the results of this genetics test can sometimes be very disturbing for the parents. So we really have to think long and hard before you request for a genetics test. So with that, I would now open Dr. Pratap Patra's talk for comments from the House. So can you, Pratap, can you tell us what kind of consent have you been taking before ordering a genetics test?
Sir, genetic tests are now routine in our clinical practice, and everybody wants to do it. Whenever you are thinking of diagnosis in pediatric hematology or pediatric hematological disorders, everybody wants the molecular confirmations, and it helps in publication as well. But there are no ethical guidelines from our institute. There is no clear-cut guidelines. If we want to send a research to outside, we are taking consent from the company that is doing the research, or the company that going to test the research, test the sample. But Institute Ethics Committee is so far is not involved in this process, and we are directly sending the samples after taking a consent that is providing by the company that is sending to us before sending the sample.
Sir.
What about the more common tests like HLA-B5 and HLA-B27 that we usually do on a day-to-day practice? I think most of us will be writing about 5 or 10 every day. So what about these investigations? Do we really require some consent or this thing, or can we just order it just like that?
See, HLA-B27 is in-house facilities are there. So there is, okay, for any test you have to take a consent, but HLA-B27 is mostly available in-house in most of the hospitals, okay? But certain genetic tests that has to be carried out by either next generation sequencing or Sanger sequencing that are not available in your institute, we are sending it outside. In that process, you have to take consent. Okay, for HLA B27, we are not taking any specific consent from
I think the
patients.
issue here is that it will be either B27 positive or negative, B5 positive or negative. You know, it may not have that much implication. But if you're ordering a whole exome sequencing or whole genome sequencing, so you are likely to land up with variants of unknown significance. Now, are they really unknown? And how do you interpret those VUSs? Some of these may have implications for the patient as well as for his siblings or for the parents. So that is where the complications arise.
You're right. There have been issues with interpretation also. There have been issues with interpretation also, that we order some tests and we are not very clear about the reports. Like I myself have said this many times that we do orders ANA or IFA typing very commonly, but truly when a report comes of 6 or 7 pages of so many SS positive, this particular histone positive, most of us are not able to interpret that positivity also. So would that also be included here?
Vignesh?
Regarding the biobanking, even in the rheumatology, biobanking helps in several issues. You can do the biomarker study to predict any disease.
Is your mic on?
Yeah. So for the biobanking, how long the samples can be stored? Is there a fixed time that you can mention in a consent, or is it just available throughout and you can access at any point of time? That is number one. And number two is regarding the consent. I think it is basically needed for genetic tests where the outcome is going to influence the treatment decisions later. And when you're going to store the samples, I think these are the two main issues where you actually need a consent. So for a HIV B27 or a B51, like as sir said, it's just a positive or a negative report. You're not going to store the sample, you're just going to discard it. And the result is there. So I don't think consent is actually needed at that point. So you can ponder upon how long the samples can be stored, and is there any specific guidelines?
There is no specific guideline on for how long the sample can be stored. There is no specific guideline on these issues.
But there should be. In an ideal world, there should be. And I think in most hospitals abroad, they mention it. It's 5 years for some samples. And so as the other thing which Dr. Pandey mentioned, that when you order the other rheumatological tests, do you really need a consent? I think, I was talking to Ms. Sheshadri just before this session. As long as it's done in good faith, as long as you have in a way explained to the patient why you're doing a particular line of investigations, maybe we do not need a consent for each little thing that we do in the outpatients or even for the admitted patients. But for any major procedure, I think, or major laboratory investigation, it is always better to have a consent. So with that, with the permission of the chair, I think we bring this session to a close. I thank both the speakers and the chairperson for conducting this session. And we would now request Ms. Elizabeth Seshadri, who is now the convener for the legal workshop. And I think this is the first time that in the IRA conference, we are having a legal workshop as part of the official program. Thank you very much.
Hi, it's a pleasure being here. So what we plan to do, my friend Mr. Bajpai Advocate and I, is we plan to divide this as I will give a basic overview of medical negligence information relating to that. And then I also noticed in the previous session that so many questions on consent were coming up. So it's obviously an area which really concerns you. So Mr. Bajpai will then take a session entirely on consent and of course practical tips also from the ground. So I'm an advocate from Chennai. Once upon a time wanted to be a doctor. My daughter became one, and after seeing what she goes through in her course, she's not become a doctor, she's studying. I realized, my God, thank God I never got into med school. Thank God I didn't study hard enough. Because, see, we lay people, we only see the white coats and the glamour and the saving lives and the movies, ka doctor, you jaan bacha diya kind of stuff. But there's so much stress involved on an everyday basis. Y'all are making situational judgments on an everyday basis. It's about death, it's about announcing bad news, it's about seeing deterioration, body fluids, dealing with, and in India, like doctor was telling me in the morning, it's about dealing with a society which thinks it's okay to beat up doctors. It is a very difficult profession. It's in that context that this topic we are looking at. I want you all to keep one thing in mind. This is a word of caution. Okay, I'm just going to figure this out. Yeah. So this isn't a black and white area. This is a gray zone. There are no specific laws that, unfortunately, that do not, they don't tell doctors, do this, do A, B, C, and you're okay, do D, E, F, and you're not okay. There is nothing specific in black and white for you. So how then, a lot of this is evolved through judge-made law, through cases. And certain principles have gotten to be written down. And those principles keep changing. Don't expect consistency. It's very disappointing sometimes. You may find similar set of facts, but you will find two judgments saying diametrically opposite stuff. Because so much depends on the facts of that case. There are nuances. There are nuances relating to the facts of that patient, facts of that doctor, etc. that will influence an outcome. So how do we advise doctors? The broad advice we give is stick to SOPs. As much as possible, put down your SOPs. Increase awareness about these issues in your teams. Not just doctor teams, but non-doctor teams in your hospitals. And always keep in mind, while you do things in good faith, keep in mind patient safety is your priority. Keep in mind patient has autonomy. Respect patient privacy and dignity. And one of the things I always tell doctors is sometimes when you read some judgments, it can be very disheartening. You have to have a heart of steel to not become a defensive practitioner. And if we made our doctors into defensive practitioners, I don't think that's good for us as a society. We need them to be careful and cautious, but not defensive practitioners. I think if you largely tell your youngsters, your young doctors, that, let's stick to customary practices, let's stick to SOPs, let's stick to, let's do things in good faith. I think to a large extent, you can avoid becoming a defensive practitioner and still push the frontiers of science. So, to start with, I'm just going to very quickly examine, what is this doctor-patient relationship? To whom do you, as a doctor, owe a duty of care? So I will guess, I'm not going to make this, I'm not going to ask you to reply. I'm going to guess that you will say that if I have an agreement to treat somebody walks in, there's an invoice, etc., you have an agreement. But now at this conference, I'm just going to give you some gray areas. In this conference, let's say the receptionist at the hotel walks up to you and says, I'm going through these symptoms. And you as a doctor say that, hey, you know what, looking at those symptoms, if I were you, I would go and get this replacement therapy, or I would go and get this surgery done. Can she hold you liable later at a point of time if something goes wrong in that follow-up action that she followed with that advice? On the other hand, I'm giving you another scenario. you're at home, you get a call from somebody, some friend, who says, my daughter is pregnant, she's 4 months pregnant, and there is this issue, blah, blah, blah. And you as a doctor say, you do these tests, you do ABC tests, go to this place, get these tests done, get these reports and come and show it to me, and thereafter we do this. Do you owe a duty of care to that patient? You haven't even spoken to the patient. You're talking to the mother. There is no express agreement between the two of you. Do you owe a duty of care? I just want you to think about these two situations, because in the first one, in an academic setting, somebody just walks up to you, and a poor doctor, I can imagine poor doctors wherever you go for a dinner, you go to play tennis in the club, you go to a restaurant, somewhere somebody is always asking you, Dr. Saab, I have a pain in my finger, I have a pain in my ear, you're expected to be on high alert all the time. But in an academic setting or a dinner setting or a restaurant setting, somebody walks up to you and says, hey, tell me this, and you do say something. You've not assumed responsibility for his treatment. You've not assumed responsibility for follow-up on how the treatment proceeds, etc. You are not liable. On the other hand, in that medicine doctor case, in the telephone case, you took very positive, affirmative steps to tell her, do 1, 2, 3, 4, come back and tell me. So you showed that you were functioning as a doctor in advising her about her daughter's health. There you could be found to be having a duty of care to that patient. Of course, emergency situations, all of you are aware, outside your clinic there may be a man who's had an accident and he clearly cannot afford your services. I'm assuming private practice, not government. You will send him somewhere else, but do you have a duty of care to him? You do till that point of time that you have stabilized him and referred him appropriately to the right people. Government doctors, very sorry, but you have a duty of care to most people. Anybody who walks into your hospital in that sense, you do have a duty of care. It's a public funded institution. Now, duty to third parties. You can imagine situations. So a doctor, pregnant mother being treated by a doctor who was exposed to, the mother exposed to measles. The doctor didn't give the medication to protect the child. Held liable when the child was born with birth defects. A communicable diseases situation, you have to notify certain diseases, etc. A foreseeable risk to family from the circumstances of the patient's illness. For instance, the doctor is treating his patient for Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which I believe comes from infected ticks in certain areas they've gone to, etc. So he's treating his patient very appropriately. His wife has also traveled with him to that place. You would think a doctor would understand that it's a foreseeable risk that the wife has also been exposed under the same circumstance to this Rocky Mountain spotted fever tick. In which case, a doctor could be was held liable when he did not warn the wife. And I understand this condition, you need early intervention, otherwise it can be fatal. You need early intervention with antibiotics. So where a doctor did not warn the wife that, hey, let me know if there would be very early symptoms, come back immediately, we start treatment. Then of course you're aware of your mandatory reporting under certain laws. For instance, POCSO, you are meant to report if you know of instances of child abuse potentially or happening. Domestic violence, it is not mandatory, they use the word may, you may report. And crime, for instance, in the recent past, we've all been fascinated by these number of pieces that, 4 or 5 cases have come out of people cutting their girlfriends and wives into X number of pieces, etc. So I'm just assuming, in the case of a psychiatrist or even the doctor, for instance, in Delhi, a doctor was stitching up this gentleman's forehead. So in the course of that conversation, let us say he says that, this injury happened while I was using the knife to hack the body into 36 pieces or 58 pieces. Does the doctor have a duty to report that? I don't know, honestly, the answer, I don't know. However, if he says that this injury happened when she and I had a tussle and she's lying at home bleeding and I need my stitches done, do you have a duty to report the case of that third party lying in his house bleeding? Yes, you do, because your Charter of Patient Rights. See, while we say there are no laws, you also have something called your Charter of Patient Rights, you have your codes of ethics, etc. And that says, yes, you do have a duty to report that. Now, what are the limits of your doctor-patient relationship? It is ongoing till properly terminated. An improper termination is an abandonment, which again your Charter of Patient Rights say you shouldn't abandon your patient. So proper termination is give the patient notice of termination and refer to another competent physician. If you're unavailable as a doctor, it's perfectly fine for doctors to go on conferences or holidays, etc. But inform that this set of patients, doctors unavailable, and make or substitute care. If a substitute goes wrong or an act of negligence on their part, you are not responsible if he was a competent substitute. Now, consent, I'm going to skip through these consent slides because my friend is going to deal with this next. Yeah. So now we come to, once it's established that you have a duty of care to any person, then what we are talking about is what is the standard of care that you give that person. Because once a standard is established, when somebody takes you to court, what court will be seeing is, have you breached that standard or not? Normally the standard, we call it as a reasonable person standard. Obviously, reasonable person is not lay person, it's a trained medical professional. So we call it the average practitioner rule. And it's not the best doctor. For instance, it's not like I will test every rheumatologist by the standard of Dr. Danda, Dr. Singh, Dr. No. It is the average doctor rule, not the best in the field. For instance, I will give you a case of, it's called the McCord case. This is where a patient walks into the clinic with shortness of breath, breathing heavily, chest pains. And the doctor seeing her, and she says she has a rupture on an injury on her hand, and she says, I do work around horses, etc. And the doctor seeing her does not send samples for lab tests, does not show any urgency in calling a specialist, and goes slow on the treatment, puts her on mild antibiotics orally to be taken. The specialist comes in due course, and the specialist finds that she needs to be moved to the ICU immediately, and a stronger course of antibiotics is started. The patient dies. So there, a set of doctors were brought in as expert witnesses, and they said that the functioning of that first doctor was inappropriate, was below standard, because one, he should have shown urgency, chest pains, breathing heavily, clearly. He should have sent samples for lab diagnosis, and he should have shown urgency in calling a specialist. So that doctor is not being tested at the standard of the specialist, but basic stuff that which he should have done at his level is where he fell short. Now this average practitioner rule, in my view, is a good thing for doctors, because coming down his forehead and he's standing there with red wire or blue wire, red wire or blue wire, kaunsa lagega to bomb will burst, which one will save the entire stadium? You know, those typical movie scenes. Sometimes doctors are in that situation. Sometimes doctors are in a situation where a decision has to be taken. You don't have the time to wait. And sometimes it could be situation A or B. A will match with C as a course of action, B will match with D as a course of action. You don't know. You're going to take a guess based on your judgment, your intuition and your experience. That's called an error of judgment. I mean, this man puts the red wire, the bomb may go off or he's saved. He becomes a hero if everybody is saved. If the bomb goes off, the poor man, if he survives, I'm assuming, is made to stand in court. But that's an error of judgment. If you show that what you have done is what any other doctor in that situation, man caught in the wrong place, wrong time, what to do? But if you can show that what you did was customary practice, what other doctors would have done at that point of time, you're in safe zone. Now, while courts set these standards, there are some things that doctors need to present to courts. For instance, I heard Dr. Danda was saying, you know, don't test on the basis of American standards on consent, etc. There's a point there. Today we have black and white rules on some of these things, but we probably have to put across that in certain localities, for instance, there is a serial on Netflix, The Good Doctor, of that autistic doctor. So they operate fantastically, they do great surgeries in their US doctor hospital situations, they're gung-ho, unique cases they find solutions for, they come up with innovative stuff, etc. Then they have an outreach program. So once in a year they go to Guatemala. In Guatemala they're operating, they choose 10 patients to operate on, and while they're operating the current goes. So these chaps the doctors push the operating table to the window, and they open the window for sunlight, for light to see. Now, if something goes wrong then, in the US, they are certainly found negligent for the generator not having come on, etc. In Guatemala, can you expect, what could he do? He had to finish his operation, he opened his window. The current's not going to come for the next 5 hours, and there is no generator in Guatemala. So these are locality-specific stuff that we have to put across in each case. In India, for instance, I see that in the rural-urban divide. You all have access to conferences, new stuff happening, literature, etc. A lot of people do not. Of course, with internet and increasing ease of travel, etc., that rule can be applied minimally. Then there is the specialist rule, which is, do you test a specialist and a specialist has more information, more experience, etc. Apply that and see when you test the particular doctor who is on the dock. The next thing I want to talk about is, see, doctors have professional disagreements on a course of treatment for the same patient. And there's nothing wrong in that. Two perfectly fine, good doctors will say, this I think will work, and another one will say, this I don't think will work. Now let's say one of them is in the dock, and you put in a doctor who says, I think I wouldn't have done this, I will do this. This is where I think we should articulate the respected minority rule, which is, if a doctor has done something which out of 100 doctors, let's say 90 say, I won't do this. But what he's done is interesting, let me watch and see how it evolves. It's something worth a try. At the end of the day, we are in science, we'll push the frontiers of science. However, this should not be taken as a reason to do disreputable fringe medical practice, or something which is so drastically in the experimentation stage that, no doctor is going to justify that. If it's a reputed, respected minority approach, courts need to know that. It's a two schools of thought approach. Your facts are unique. You must tell the courts the uniqueness of your facts. Okay. Now, when litigation hits, there are, of course, the burden. Normally, the burden is on the complainant who goes to court to show that the doctor's practice is negligent or has fallen below the standard. But sometimes that burden shifts on the doctor. As in, the complainant just needs to go and present the facts to the court, and then it is for the doctor to say, no, see, this has happened because whatever the reasons be, I wasn't negligent. And those are what we in law call recepta loquitur cases. They are so blatant, they are so in your face. For instance, left leg was to be amputated, but you amputate the right leg. Like I think Sridevi's mother in the US. Or let us say, an instrument is left inside. You do a scan, you're going to find a scissor or a forceps or something. This is so in your face that ideal advice, these are situations where you must acknowledge that these things should be settled. And it's okay, we can settle those cases. It's the other accusations where doctors need to be aware on how to take this forward. Where the burden is on the complainant, but how much do you show in your defense? Now, in terms of how much do they have to show to prove negligence? It's not a layman perception. For instance, you go sit at a dinner meet, and behind the back of the doctors, you will always hear a conversation which said, "Arey, my chacha went into hospital, he was there for 6 months, he came back, theek hi nahi hua, yahan se pain is taraf ho gaya, blah, blah, blah." Everybody is coming up with a doctor-hospital story, and especially as private hospitals grow and people are spending more, their complaints are also increasing. It's not a layman's perception based on which the facts have to be tested. It has to be tested by expert evidence, by sometimes the doctor's evidence itself, interrogatories will be issued, questions will be asked to the doctor saying, what is the standard, what do you normally do, and what did you do in this case, why did you do, etc. You don't have a right to silence in civil cases. You have to put across what you have done. And how courts look at it. See, one, they will say now largely, preponderance or largely looking at the evidence, does it look like more likely than not it was the doctor's conduct which led to that injury or harm? With a reasonable medical certainty, can we say that it was the doctor's conduct that led to that particular injury or harm? See, here we must remember that when a person comes to interact with a doctor, he is already sick. He is already in a bad state, or a state where he's not doing too well. What the doctor has done, has that caused the injury with which he has come to court? That causation, that direct nexus. Several cases you will find where they go to court saying, mar gaya, doctor is responsible. Deterioration ho gaya, doctor is responsible. It's for us to show that the causation or the nexus between what the doctor actually did and that specific injury that he's complaining about. That link must be established to hold a doctor liable for what he has done. Now, this is not an easy burden for a complainant to discharge. In some cases, it's very easy. For instance, there are some cases where it's an extremely easy thing to show. In those cases where chances for survival or chances for improvement are less than 50% or poor chances, those are the cases where the chance for a complainant to prove negligence against a doctor are so low that sometimes, see, at the end of the day, it's a human being sitting there as a judge. Sometimes judges start thinking, did what the doctor do reduce his chances to improve? Or did it substantially increase the risk of harm? For instance, if there's a child with a head injury, walks into a doctor's clinic, and the doctor sends the child back home without having done the diagnostic test, which would have shown that there was a fracture in the skull. Now, if not intervened, 100% the child is dying. What was argued in court was, even if intervened, even if the doctor had identified it and intervened, there is a far less than 50% chance of this child surviving, maybe surviving for now, but in a few days, death was imminent. Unfortunately, in that case, the doctor was held liable for having reduced chances. There was another case in Israel where a doctor was doing a life-saving surgery, where he didn't give the BP medication before the surgery. So it was found in trial that yes, not giving the BP medication before that surgery was too basic a mistake. It was too basic, anybody would have given it. However, experts said that even if he had given that BP medication, that patient died, but even if he had given the BP medication, the chances of that patient surviving were 20%, 30%. In those cases, should you be holding the doctor's conduct as responsible? So these cases, in that case, the court held yes, liable, however, quantum of damages awarded, etc., brought down. So you also have a middle approach where they will say, yeah, reducing the chance of survival, plus, how do in that case, once shown that he reduced the chance, let's prove, proper proof that there was a direct nexus. Okay, in multiple hospital scenarios, sometimes you will have to look like what was the proximate cause. Sometimes what went wrong is in the first hospital and they come to the second hospital in a situation where what you did has not caused the injury or the harm. The facts will then tell you it has to be the proximate cause of harm. Sometimes what the second person did could have aggravated the harm. In that case, you may advise saying the second doctor's intervening action or the superseding cause is what is to be held liable, not what the first doctor, even though some harm was done in the first case. For instance, there was a doctor who did not identify a particular fracture, a serious fracture. His specialist comes in and identifies that fracture. However, another doctor whom he says, go inform the patient's family, he misses doing that. Now, who's responsible? Is it the first doctor or the second doctor? The specialist is off board. It was argued that it was the first doctor's problem was sorted out when the specialist came into the picture. However, the cause of death was because the second doctor forgot to tell the family. And then, of course, as joint and several, if 2 or 3 people doing the procedure together, things go wrong. Now, some of the kind of complaints that you will see. One, consent. Always, several cases you will find where they say consent was not taken, it was not informed consent, or it was not, all the relevant information was not given. I will let Mr. Bajpai deal with this. Post-op care situations. Surgery, sometimes things deteriorate, goes off. Be careful on causation. For instance, a rheumatoid arthritis patient who had to go through a knee surgery. So I understand that 4.2% of rheumatoid arthritis long-time medication patients, what I understand is that there's a chance for deep infection post-surgery. Now, the patient dies and the doctor is sued. The court held that, see, this is an inherent risk. This is part of the known risk that is there, and you don't hold a doctor responsible for risks post, this kind of a event post-op. Emergencies presenting on the operating table. Often these are about consent. You know, this happened, but permission was not taken at that point of time. Prescriptions and allergies. Normally, response time is the big issue. When an allergy is reported, you take time to respond. Like doctor said, anaphylactic shock, but that was, of course, it was immediate. Drug allergies, etc. These are other kinds of cases that will come. Documentation issues, unfortunately, with the volumes and times that Indian hospitals deal with. For instance, a DVC was done, but nothing. They couldn't produce any when something went wrong in the procedure. It's always only when something goes wrong. So people get away with all this otherwise. When something goes wrong, they said you couldn't show the documentation which showed that this procedure was needed. There was no diagnostic report, nor a clinical report which suggested that this procedure was needed to be done, and therefore liability. Other defenses, limitation, of course, but limitation from cause of action. And I saw in your earlier presentation, some of your medication, starts showing effects much later. So when you say 2 years, it's not that 2 years from the first time you meet the patient, but it could be from whenever he thinks that damage has happened to him or he's identified the harm connected to the doctor's result. Elective cases, that's where the patient assumes the risk. And this is why in your consent forms you'll say, all these kind of surgeries will have 5% risk, 6% risk, etc. Because then he's consenting to take on that risk. And he knows that if I don't take on that risk, this is the altered lifestyle I will have to live, and I don't want to do that. I want to take this risk. Now, Good Samaritan situations, and this, for instance, a dermatologist on a flight, he's not delivered a baby for 30 years, let's say, but suddenly somebody's going around saying, a doctor on board, we have a baby coming out or whatever. And the poor chap, in the process of delivering this baby, let's say something goes wrong. Those are situations where you explain that, the man, you don't want a situation, a society where a doctor will refuse to put up his hand when they say, is there a doctor on board? See, it's not my area of practice. He will go there in good faith and try and help people. So you understand that these are Good Samaritan situations where he did what he knew best there. Of course, hospitals' responsibilities. Just one thing I want to highlight in case there are people who are involved in administration of hospitals is now you also must be aware as hospitals, holders of data, you have a responsibility. The IT Act requires you to report. Now, in the recent past, there have been many cyber attacks on hospital records. Many hospitals have been reporting that networks have been entered into. You have a duty to report within 6 hours to the Indian emergency, your admin must be informed about, follow the IT Act procedures. There is a duty to report within 6 hours. So ensure that info goes back to your hospitals. Okay, so I'm not going to get into these details, but I'm sure you're aware, bills, costs, your patient, Charter of Patient Rights says they're entitled to know what specific breakups, what each is going to charge, what procedures charge. Consent for diagnostic is different from therapeutic. For surgical emergencies, however good-hearted you are, if it is possible to close up the patient, come back and get consent, do that. So distinguish emergencies from patient convenience. For instance, you open up somebody and you find it's not appendicitis as you thought, but you found a gangrenous gallbladder and you say, "Arey, open to kiya, let me remove it." He's going to come after you for some reason. So better close it, come back, get permission, and then do it on some other date. You're aware of DNRs, you know the new rules on euthanasia. Ensure that you're aware about all these things. Telemedicine guidelines are there on confidentiality and care, data privacy. So your takeaways. Value medical literature and expert evidence. And as an association, I think a lot can be done in getting organized SOPs and best practices in place. Have a good documentation and records maintenance policy. This conversation, I'm so impressed that a doctors association is actually having this conversation, because this is something that you really need to have, not just with your doctors, but when you're held liable, when somebody accuses you or takes you to court, he sees you as your last point of contact, the doctor or the hospital, but he's upset about the ambulance man, the nurse, so many things. Empower all of them with conversations about ethics and medical negligence issues, etc. Doctor was saying in the morning, a lot of these problems can be sorted out, or rather can be prevented if we communicate, because honestly, the patient looks at you all as gods. Today's India, the patient looks at you as gods. Whatever you do, they don't want to accuse you of anything unless the communication has hurt them at some level. So if you can train youngsters, etc., there's also the good cop, bad cop. Some doctor, the amount of stress that you all work under, I can understand, if something is said in a harsh way, etc. If there is a method of lightening it, somebody else stepping in, good cop, bad cop, whatever. You do your communication right, to a large extent you reduce the number of cases that come. Do in good faith, keep patient safety as priority, patient autonomy, patient privacy, and get malpractice insurance. That's a basic. It's evolving, get malpractice insurance, speak to insurance providers about organizing these things. And when a case hits, don't panic, don't get into denial mode. Don't think that, "Arey, I'm a good person." It's there, it's a fact, it's a reality that we're all going to face. Any profession, any work, any manufacturer, these things, it will hurt you a little bit more than others. Why? Because fundamentally you've chosen the profession for doing good, and you can't imagine that somebody can accuse you of having done something to hurt somebody. But do your internal inquiry with all the stakeholders, including the nursing team, pharmacology, etc. Get written responses in order by all stakeholders, and ensure that you're checking, that's internally circulated by the clinical team, and ensure that the responses match. Give your legal team what responses you've prepared, your medical records and paravise comments. Please don't expect your legal team to just make magic out of, my doctor is too busy to talk to you kind of a thing. Give them that support, and then you all can actually come out of problems. Ensure your records are in order, responses of all clinicians, nursing staff, etc. are consistent, give backup evidence, and then the legal team will assess and recommend whether you should settle or defend. Thank you. So that is from me. I'm now going to call on Mr. Bajpai to talk about consent and practical tips from the ground. Thank you.
Most common problems faced by doctors as far as law is concerned. But first, a very fundamental question: why should a doctor know law? The most fundamental question why we all are here sitting. where the simplest of simple answer is it costs a lot if I am sued. Friends, 10 years back, 12 crore rupees was granted as compensation in a case of negligence by the Honorable Supreme Court of India. How many doctors can earn and save 12 crore rupees in their career? A sure shot way of getting bankrupt. Is this why we should know law? 5 years back, media across the nation was plastered with a survey report. Survey was done by none other but Indian Medical Association, the national body. Late Dr. K.K. Agarwal, he had initiated this initiative. 33,000 doctors across India were interviewed. And the report was mind-boggling. 82.7% doctors in India, they fear violence, they fear legal problems. This is a cause of their stress. Quite rightly put by Hindu. Healers turn sufferers. So should we know law because we want to keep our stress under control? Friends, 3 things. Yes, to protect my wealth, my hard-earned money. But then we have professional indemnity. To a great extent, if at all something goes wrong, you are protected. There is a bigger reason why you should know law. And that reason is, friend, your reputation as a doctor. Any profession. Whether it is a doctor, whether it is an architect, or whether it is a lawyer. We build our professional practice step by step, brick by brick. Over years, we earn our reputation, our name. And just one incident is enough. Earlier it was media, now you add social media. No one has control over it. But there is a bigger reason, friends, why we all should know law. Have you ever wondered why law punishes a doctor? Law punishes a doctor only for one reason, one big reason. And the reason is that the doctor has acted in a way that has endangered patient safety. That's all. Or it had the potential of endangering patient safety. If at all, no harm, no injury, no death has been caused to the patient. And friends, this should be the biggest reason why doctors must know law. Patients have reposed faith in you, their life and limb. You are bound to protect it. Friends, statistically, I was editor of a law reporter for doctors for 12 years. Can vouch for this data. 2/3 of the problems of Indian doctors, they arise from improper consent and improper documentation. And as a student of comparative law, I am very happy with the statistics. I am very happy. Because unlike the developed country, unlike the Western countries where the patients, they actually allege on the key competency of the doctor. Doctor, you have failed to diagnose me. Doctor, you gave me a wrong drug. It was contraindicated. What are the patients alleging in India? Consent was taken, name written of the procedure was not proper. The signature of the anesthetist was missing. Discharge card given without follow-up advice. What is this? So friends, very small mistakes that you do, especially in procedural aspects, that is required, and trust me, 2/3 of your problems are gone. Coming to consent, the topic on which I have to speak. So as Advocate Elizabeth had rightly said, every patient has a right to full information. Patient's autonomy is the order of the day. That doctor's paternalism, gone are the days. So now the patient has a right to take informed decision. And as rightly put by Dr. Danda earlier, means it's really confusing as not only as a lawyer but as a common man. In spite of all the information that I give, is the patient really competent enough to take a decision? Friends, I practice as a counsel. Elizabeth happens to be a lawyer. She is a partner in a law firm. There are times when lawyers, law firms, they brief me, or rather that's what they do. My role is to stand in the court of law and argue matters. There is another advocate who briefs me. It is not the litigant who briefs me. Why do they brief me? They brief me because there will be instances where I will react in a proper manner, in the best manner, better than the other advocates who have other jobs to do. And in spite of getting all the brief from the lawyers, there are times when I do mistakes in court. But then, fair enough, I am also a man. I can make mistakes. I don't take consent of the lawyer sitting beside me whether this is what I should speak before the court or not. It is at the heat of the moment I take a decision and I say something. Ultimately, it may harm the lawyer because the client happens to be of the lawyer, not of the counsel. But fair enough, friends, this is the age of patient's autonomy. This aspect can't be discussed and deliberated. You have to take consent. Patient can give consent, patient can withdraw consent, patient can give you partial consent. You have to honor it. Any victim of sexual assault, male, female, child, you should not be touching that patient for clinical examination without a specific written consent of the patient. Generally, policemen bring in. All those of you who are there in the government hospitals, very common problem. साहब देख लीजिए, examine कर लीजिए, written directions from the government. You have to have consent of the patient. Duty to explain and counsel the patient. It is on the doctor in charge of the patient. Usually it is not done, especially when a doctor becomes too great, too big. Counseling the patient is not my job, my residents will do that. And in most of the cases, why only government hospital, even in the private sectors, there is no counseling. A day before the surgery, or at times even an hour before the surgery, the nurse comes with a blank form and signatures are taken. This is wrong, friends, please avoid it. First, let us clear a few wrong notions many of us may be carrying. Legal liability for improper consent. It is the hospital's responsibility. I am a surgeon, I will do surgery and that is all. Sorry. It is your responsibility. Hospital may be held vicariously liable. A part of the compensation they may also have to pay. It's a different story. But the responsibility is on the doctor in charge of the patient. You call him by any name, attending doctor, treating doctor. principal surgeon, principal anesthetist. It is that doctor who has to take consent. Anything goes wrong in consent, that doctor is going to face the consequences. Another aspect as far as consent is concerned, not directly consent. Patient dies, you are not aware about the cause of death. Many hospitals have that declaration. I am completely satisfied with the treatment and we have no problem with this hospital and doctor, and we are taking away the dead body. And based on that declaration from relatives, you release the dead body. There are times when doctors request the attendants, no, we don't know the cause of death, we can't give you death certificate. This body has to go for post-mortem, and they say, we don't have any objections, we are taking away the body. There are times when the patient's relatives may not be really powerful people, they will cry before you, "Arey doctor sahab, why do you want to cut the body? He has already faced a lot, chhod dijiye." And then out of humanitarian concerns, you leave the body. 6 months down the line, wisdom dawns upon those very relatives that the doctor was negligent. And one of the first allegations that is made in the court, doctor was negligent, he knew he was a negligent. Only to hide his negligence, he did not refer the body for post-mortem. Now what is the law saying? Law is very clear. If you do not know the cause of death, if you are not absolutely sure about the cause of death, you will not give a death certificate. You will refer the body to police. You are no one to decide whether post-mortem will be done or not. That is the responsibility of the policeman. Where does consent come in? There is no role for consent here. You simply have to inform the police. They will take care. Now it is between the police and the relatives. But taking a consent, taking a declaration, releasing the body, in the court of law you will have to face music. Then in the northern part of the country, I often find letterheads, discharge cards, very boldly they write one line at the bottom: not to be used for legal purposes, not for medical legal purposes. Friends, this is not going to help anyone, least of all you. Whether you write this, whether you don't write this, if the patient wants to go to the court of law, he will certainly go to the court of law. And this document, this single line is not going to protect you. In fact, this is a reminder to the patient that he can always sue you in the court of law. So please don't write something like this. One very fundamental aspect that should be clarified. Patient's consent has nothing to do with negligence. These are two different things. Not taking consent is negligence, is deficiency of service, yes, fine. Taking improper consent, yes, you can be sued for this. But because I have taken consent, the patient cannot sue me, that's wrong. If you are negligent, if your conduct falls below the standard of care, then it's an independent cause of action for which the patient can sue you in spite of giving consent. Don't mix both of them. You have to take consent and you have to perform the surgery correctly. You have to give treatment correctly. Consent is not going to come there. Yes, when the patient says, "Oh, I was not informed about the fees, I was not informed about the complications," you can always show if it is written in the consent, "All this we have informed you, we have taken a written consent." That's all. But these are two different things. Please don't mix them. Three very common mistakes that doctors do. First of all, fairly common, in fact this is the norm, consent in India is reduced to a formality. One day before the surgery, someone comes, takes consent, It's done. It is improper. Proper counseling, proper disclosure must precede consent. Second mistake, and this mistake is not limited only to consent. Every aspect of your practice, please keep this in mind. Failure of the patient to follow your advice, delay on the part of the patient to follow your advice, insistence of the patient to do something that you have not advised. Yes, patient has all the rights to do this. But then why should you suffer for these consequences? And we see doctors suffering for patients wrong. Why? One simple mistake that you do. You don't record this anywhere in your medical records. I had advised this investigation, patient said I don't have money. In fact, the worst hit are gynecologists, childbirth, cesarean. First of all, the moment the obstetrician announces a cesarean, the entire family is up in arms. Why cesarean? Mother gave a normal birth, grandmother gave a normal birth. Now once they agree, after they having second, third, fourth opinion and the poor lady is being trooped inside, a stout man comes and says, "Ruk jao, abhi nahi." Kya ho gaya? Rahu Kala. Half an hour you have to stop. Now when to do surgery, fair, it's the age of informed consent, patient and the relatives will take a decision. But in the court of law, when the court puts a question, doctor, at 9 o'clock you had written cesarean advice. Why did you do it at 2 p.m., 6 hours? You require this much time. You have all the reasons. First they did not give consent, then the mama came with Rahu Kalam. Where have you recorded it? Even in government hospitals, most common statements made by patients, I don't have money. Write it down. Patient financially not able to do this investigation. I have advised. My science says I should advise this investigation. I have advised. Patient has said financially he can't take. Fair enough. One simple sentence. But please do start writing something like this. And then friends, there are still some doctors who think that patient's consent, if the patient is conscious, adult, in spite of that, if the siblings, if the spouse, they will give consent, it is good consent, sorry. If the patient is conscious, oriented and adult, it is only the patient who can give consent and no one else. Please take consent for even the smallest and most innocuous interventions. If you are in a dilemma whether I should take consent, not take consent, better take consent rather than not taking it. Because once the procedure is over, the patient is discharged. This allegation, you have not taken consent, is going to stay there. You can't undo it. Even investigations and diagnostic procedures that require any type of intervention, each type of anesthesia, if you are contemplating either this or that, please write it down in one consent form only. Okay, I'll go in for nerve block, otherwise general. Fair enough. Anticipated alternatives. Especially when you do endoscopy or something like this, and if it fails, you go in for open, you can take a composite consent for both. A relatively new technique or drug, please take consent. Something that is very, a drug that causes death, paralysis, something like this, better take consent. For blood transfusion, consent has to be taken. And any surgery which may result in sterility, consent of both husband and wife is needed. Something that is there in IMCR 2002 has to be followed and is not followed. Probably no one knows of it. So proxy consent if the patient is incompetent, mentally unfit, disoriented, minor emergency, you have to take consent from the nearest relatives. Dispute between parents, matrimonial disputes are rising, so consent from anyone is valid. As far as minors are concerned, below 12 years of age, take consent only of the guardian, of the parent. Above 18, only the patient. But between 12 to 18 years, please take consent of both the patient as well as the guardian. Reason: a 12-year-old patient can give consent under the criminal laws of India. His consent is valid. Protect you in both criminal and civil laws. So in consent form, what you should be recording: diagnosis, the scientific name of the procedure, nature and purpose of the proposed treatment, common side effects and risks, not the uncommon one. If there is any alternative method, risks and prognosis if the treatment is not given, the probability of success, the time required for recovery, the time that you have fixed for the surgery, and then your signature of the patient, doctor and witnesses, and date and time when the consent was signed. So some very pragmatic tips on filling the consent form, because when today in some hospitals you don't have the consent form, which is 100% digital. The first very simple tip: please ensure that the consent form is filled in one pen and the person filling the consent form is not changed. Quite often happens in some government hospitals. We have seen those consent forms. Nurse A starts writing it, then her duty ends, nurse B completes it, and signature is taken. Now please understand, this consent form is with the hospital and it is produced in the court. The lawyer for the patient very nicely says, "Sir, can you see the difference in ink? Whatever is written in light blue, that was written when my patient signed the form. The form was with them. Whatever has been written in dark ink, that was written later on." And we are getting cases where courts are drawing adverse inference. Blank spaces, please don't leave them. Put a dash. If you can't write any, at least put dash. Because there are cases where courts are drawing adverse inference. See the hospital, see how careless they are. They have not even filled the entire consent form. It is their own consent form. Alteration, additions, erasures must be avoided. Not possible. And wherever you do that, or if you are putting in some handwritten entries, you take patient's initials and signature. If the consent is running more than one pages, please take patient's signature on each and every page. There are problematic patients. If there are high risk patients, please take a high risk consent where you take a witness also to the consent. Now as far as interventions, procedures, surgeries are concerned, every intervention, please check the consent form physically, personally. Please take consent before the date, 1 or 2 days before the day of surgery. Again, adverse comments coming from the courts. Though legally speaking, once the consent is given, till the time it is withdrawn by the patient or the surgery is completed, it remains valid. But unfortunately, there are times when the court is saying, "Oh, you took consent 2 weeks back when the patient was admitted." So let us avoid it. If there are 2 or more surgeries which have to be performed together, separate consent has to be there for both of them. If there are any anticipated additional alternative procedures that you may have to perform, you can take advance consent for that. That is permitted. And consent obviously remains valid even if the procedure is delayed. Now one aspect that Advocate Elizabeth did mention, you want to extend the surgery, you opened it for gallbladder, you find something out there. Now for no other reason, only humanitarian approach, you say fine, I can take care of this also. Should you not? And the law says no. If there is no imminent danger to the life and limb of the patient, please close the patient, let the patient come out, give consent and then go ahead. Imminent, you don't do, tomorrow it would be late. Then yes, certainly you are permitted. Otherwise, don't extend your surgery. Whatever has been consented to, keep yourself limited to that. But if at all you have to extend, some simple precautions. One, you can come out of the OT, explain it to the relatives. Something like this we have found. It's an emergency and we want to extend it. These aspects are not mandatory but good practices. They will help you. Not only in court of law, but even otherwise. The relatives will after all understand. The doctor came out, he explained and then he went ahead with the surgery. And second most important thing, friends, understand something. Understand that you have done something which is not permitted in ordinary situation. So your documentation has to be 100% perfect. Write down the reasons elaborately in your surgery notes. Call your friends, your peers. Take their advice. Because you have extended the surgery, you have to do all this. Refusal to consent, yes, you have to honor it. Please don't take it as an insult. Competent patient has a right to refuse. Even guardians of incompetent patient, they can refuse. Prisoners, persons under police custody, even they can refuse. But friends, there was a judgment by the Honorable Supreme Court, Samira Kohli's case, where the Supreme Court of India has said in so many words that consent in India need not be the American Canterbury judgment, consent. It has to be real. We understand socially, economically, educationally, we Indians are not up to that level where you need a 40-page and a 100-page consent and you need all that transcriptions to be there. It has to be real. But unfortunately, friends, although this judgment is there, we find that the lower courts are not acting in accordance with this judgment. Supreme Court anyway, even in recent years, 1-2 years, the judgments that they have given are fantastic. They have followed Samira Kohli. Unfortunately, the lower courts, the district courts and the state consumer commissions, they are not following it. Friends, this is a website, www.patientsconsent.com. It is a initiative of Institute of Medicine and Law and nearly all the major national medical associations. I presume Dr. Danda has been a part of this or your association has been involved with it. IRA. Dr. Danda, you draft the SOP on patient's consent. I have seen your, if I am not wrong. Yeah, fair. So nearly all the major medical societies, they come on this platform and for the last 10 years we are drafting this SOP. Friends, every year this SOP gets updated. It is freely available. Anyone can download it. And it's a joint effort of lawyers and doctors. No one has an IPR. You can use it, reuse it, whatever you want to do. Good resource. Every year you can go and just view or download this SOP on patient's consent, a very comprehensive resource. Friends, as I represent Institute of Medicine and Law, we had a very unfortunate incident a few months back where a young gynecologist was forced to commit suicide because the police charged her in a criminal case, charging her with murder. Friends, very basically, although this does not lie into my domain, or rather I don't want to speak on it, friends, in criminal cases you have excellent protections. Mind you, no other category, not even member of parliaments, judges have that protection what has been given to doctors from 2005. There is a Jacob Matthews judgment, please download it, keep it in your clinic, in your hospital. A policeman cannot proceed against you in a criminal case without a expert opinion. Patients who go to a private, to a criminal court to file a private complaint, even they have to bring an expert opinion from another doctor. And the Honorable Supreme Court has said that unlike others, don't arrest doctors in a routine manner. You get 6 months of time, that is the least that you get in criminal proceedings, to get all your defenses on. No other community, not even Member of Parliament. Member of Parliament have a protection of 3 or 4 days. That too only for 6 or 7 months when their house is in session. The investigating officer will write a letter to the Speaker of that house. Sir, I want to arrest so and so Member of Parliament. FIR has been lodged under so and so section. And maximum 4 days. That is history. So friends, that's all. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Non-evidence based, harmful, toxic things are being propagated by politicians, the governments and everybody. We have to struggle today, media, with social media, with Babas and Swamis who are multi-billionaires, with the government, with lawyers, with politicians, with social activists, with everything. He finds all the opposition leaders who was in power in the previous government are corrupt and put half of them to jail. Knowing fully the next time when they lose the election, the other party comes to power, they'll put them to jail again. 99% of the time it is not real corruption. It is vendetta. Same thing in medical profession. There's jealousy. We are human beings. The jealousy is probably something which causes. You are sure the Calcutta example of 6 crore. It was a doctor whose third wife died in unnatural circumstances. And the doctor...
There was no professional rivalry. That you can't, in fact, let me tell you, professional rivalry would be, and that also I understand because you know I am in this domain, happens to be my expertise. Doctors only come to me. Okay. 70% of the cases it's professional rivalry between when a patient comes to the court, because the other rheumatologist is going to say, "Acha, Doctor Danda ne ye diya, मैं होता तो यार ये नहीं देता." He'll just put a line. That's enough.
Exactly.
Okay, and the patient goes to the court.
Absolutely.
I am not on that. If you see the cases, it is a gynecologist who has gone to a cardiac surgeon and is dissatisfied and sues the cardiac surgeon.
Yes.
It is the gynecologist, even in that case, if you are talking about the Kolkata case, that American doctor who sued, he was practicing in America, or rather doing research in America. Dr. Sukumar Mukherjee was from...
I'm sorry, Dr. Kunal Sahas has been doing this kind of things only. He has done it to many other people.
So post 94 he is doing all this. Earlier he was there in US. Let us not... He was in US after his wife's death. And after this 12 crore case, now he is in... That is fine. He had no professional rivalry with Dr. Sukumar Mukherjee.
It may not be professional rivalry always. It may be a sense of suspicion because being a medical professional, maybe he thinks that I should get a more special care as a doctor. I do not know that. Maybe you know the answer better. But I
don't know the answer. That's why I am putting it.
I also don't know. It can be studied definitely. But I can tell you one thing. As a doctor, when you go as a patient to a hospital, we definitely see the shortcomings of the hospitals. It's not often, I cannot blame a doctor himself for that. It is the system where I have to go to my own hospital for something with my relative, I have to wait. So sometime, if I bypass the rule, someone will make noise. And abroad it's even worse. I waited for my son to get a vaccine in a pediatric casualty for nearly 4 hours to see a junior doctors. So what I'm trying to say, system is that we are handling 1.5 billion population. 1/3 of human beings have musculoskeletal problems lifetime. 5% have got treatable, highly treatable autoimmune rheumatic diseases. And how many rheumatologists in this country? 1,500. And out of that, only about 200 or 300 have been trained in the country. Others had special training, or they are physicians with special interest in rheumatology. So imagine the WHO recommendations, 1 in 80,000. For 80,000 rheumatologists, we need one rheumatologist. For 80,000 people, we need one rheumatologist. We have only 0.7% of the requirement of WHO. We have 1,500 for 1.5 billion people. So you can imagine that. So obviously, what will the doctor do? What will the hospital do? And we cannot do ideal care. As I said, if you give me, I see 10 patients a day, all the doctors 10 patients a day, and they can survive with money for he, his family, his children's education, his own healthcare, his own family, a little bit of break. I think doctors deserve that also. If you have to have that, can you manage seeing 10 patients in private practice? I don't think so. If you charge more, then they should paisa khane wala, as I said. So this is the thing, sir. I really don't know what is the cause, but this needs, both from the legal circle and from the physician circle, a lengthy discussion and process that we need to end this. Immediately after this, we have a session with the patients. If you are happy, you can attend. Thank you.
Dr. Dan. So put out your this anguish must be coming out. Probably at the end of every conference, a statement that, more kindly, these are the problems we face, etc. Or I don't know how you're going to get this to be communicated, etc. So certainly we hear that anguish. Thankfully, I mean, one of the things Mr. Bajpai was mentioning is in the last couple of years, we're having some very good judgments coming out from the Supreme Court which show that they understand that, we're taking calculated risks here. That it isn't possible to sit and outline like you say, every allergy, every post-prescription allergy, etc. And that's where SOPs really matter. As far as you can, I mean, if you have your association as a dedicated team to just keep looking at problems rheumatologists face, and then, okay, this drug, like you said in the morning, one drug went out of fashion and another one comes in, I'm sure that has another problem. SOPs which and then you hand it over to every practitioner, the junior doctor in that clinic will know how to translate this into the consent forms, etc. You can keep putting corrective measures, etc. as an association. Take the conversation out, keep putting down SOPs and keep this conversation going.
So when I was the president of the society, we formed a legal and ethics cell of Indian Medical Association. Dr. Surjit has made the first, as you said, first time in India, any professional medical body had its own ethical guidelines. And we have it is in the website, so we do that. I am not saying that we also want to introspect and improve our own care to know more, but I am not saying it from personal angle. I am saying it from the everyday news. It angers me, disturbs me, it upsets me, stresses me, and it creates a sense of mistrust. And the mistrust is not exactly from patient. It is from some other quarters. Somebody is provoking them. Somebody is creating that thing. So we are so much aware of our rights, but we are not aware of our own responsibility. Even a patient has a responsibility, a family has a responsibility, society has a responsibility. The healthcare or the quality of life in Europe after the Second World War did not go up by doctors and medicine. It is by the society, by the preventive healthcare system, by the public health system. That. So I was saying that doctors cannot be held responsible for every ill health.
Thank you, Dr. Renda. Thank you, Dr. Bajpai, Elizabeth Singh, for brilliant. We'll have a patients meeting now. The same issues are going to happen later. Thank you all. My apologies, Surjit, for coming late. Thank you. We close the session.